Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Donald Trump will soon visit Europe. He has a very busy agenda, and it's unclear what kind of reception he will get. Topping his itinerary will be trade relations, NATO, and Russia. Never before has an American president been expected with so much apprehension. The Trump juggernaut continues. Cross-talking estranged allies. I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. In Oxford, we have Ted See. He is a senior policy consultant at British American Security Information Council. And in Oslo, we have Glenn Diesen. He is a visiting scholar at the Higher School of Economics. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Marcus, let me go to you first in London. With the advent of Donald Trump, and I'm not even saying the administration of Donald Trump, but of Donald Trump, is his vision of America First compatible with the mission that we're told by the think tanks and the 4,000 NATO bureaucrats? Is are the two compatible, NATO's mission and Donald Trump? Go ahead, Marcus.
Yes, I do believe that, and I believe that 1.5 years into Donald Trump's presidency, he has clearly and categorically demonstrated that he's like his predecessors. I said on Crosstalk during his election campaign in 2016 and afterwards that there would be no changes to American foreign policy under Trump presidency, and that there would be no changes to NATO under a Trump presidency. I think a lot of people were living in cloud cuckoo land, or there were ideological reasons for why people really thought Mr. Trump was going to change American foreign policy. And of course, he hasn't done anything like that. Under him, he has increased NATO's presence on the western borders of the Russian Federation. And of course, he has now directly involved America in Syria. Twice he has attacked Syria with cruise missiles. On the first occasion in April 2017, that cruise missile attack resulted in the deaths of 20 Syrian soldiers. And NATO under Mr. Trump is strong and is getting stronger. Last year, Mr. Trump agreed to the accession to NATO of Montenegro. Some people laughed at that, but these people don't understand the significance of that. Now that Montenegro is in NATO, that means NATO is now the sole master of the Adriatic Sea. And soon Macedonia will apply, and then Ukraine will apply. And okay. Mr. Trump is agreeing to this.
Okay, Marcus, let me go to Ted in Oxford. But having what you just said there, a lot of other people are saying that he wants to tweak the NATO alliance, not dismantle it. I mean, you know, Angela Merkel, for example, the relationship that Trump has with Angela Merkel, not very good. We know that he wants a review of the number of American troops that are in Germany, finding it, it's 70 plus years after the end of the Second World War. There's 35,000 troops there. He's saying the same thing about South Korea. And we have, it's just not about NATO. It's also about trade relations. And it seems to me that I guess I'll kind of answer my own question, is that I don't think America First is compatible with traditional American foreign policy, at least the pillars of it. Not to say that those pillars are going to disappear. Go ahead, your take on it, Ted in Oxford.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think we have to look at the multiplicity of Trump policies across the board and not just try and narrowly focus on what we usually call foreign policy, because I think that's a huge mistake. I would argue in the first place that I tend to agree with you that Trump is a subversive element when it comes to the traditional NATO alliance, because he's questioning its integrity and its existence in a backhanded manner. But more importantly, by focusing on trade and by starting what some people are regarding as a tariff war, but I don't personally, he's challenging the WTO and the fundamentals of international political and economic discourse since the end of World War II. And then beyond that, he's also very much against open borders. He's very much interested in limiting migration and refugee movements into the U.S. And I think he's sending a signal to Europeans that that kind of politics can be very popular, as we've already discovered in Italy and other places.
That's a good point. And let's go to Oslo. Glenn, Trump's real mantra when it comes to NATO, he's not interested in tanks and planes and whatnot. He's interested in money, okay? And he has not let this go. He keeps pounding away at it. I mean, he said a few news cycles ago is that the EU is just as bad as China, okay? I mean, he wants people to pay their way. I mean, I have the numbers right here. Germany only pays 1.1% of its GDP of $3.8 trillion. That's a year, okay? It's supposed to pay 2%. And if NATO is all about facing off Russia, well, Germany's GDP is 3 times Russia's, okay? So, I mean, we'll get to the Russia angle soon, but basically he wants everybody to pay their bills, and that's how he's being the disruptor. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, no, I agree with that assessment because he is quite militaristic and to a certain extent more aggressive than Obama in both Ukraine and Syria. However, I think that he still contributes to a crisis in the alliance simply because he expresses this extreme hostility towards paying for the security of allies. But more importantly, Trump has often questioned the value of NATO itself, as the Cold War has been over for some time, and he merely sees the main threats as coming from terrorism and China. So I actually see Trump's lack of commitment to this Cold War security architecture as being his strength, as it could make him more prepared to strike deals as a multipolar world emerges. And this effectively undermines NATO. However, I don't think he comes to Russia bearing gifts. I think it's more, different priorities. And as we see with trade, the WTO, with NATO, it's at the end of the day, it's all about money. And I guess, his main concern is that, this is how empires die, when wealth is diverted from the core to the periphery, and the core begins to crumble.
Okay. Well, Marcus, I actually think this is part of Trump's strategy, because this is the Achilles heels of the NATO alliance. They don't want to pay their way. They want the Americans to do it. And Trump is saying no more of that. And we have the prospect, and I think it's actually kind of genius in a way. He's going to meet with Putin afterwards in Helsinki, and everyone's trembling in their boots. He might make a deal. He might make a deal. What deal would that be? I mean, I find watching Western mainstream media to be just hysterical, okay? Because usually they don't know what they're talking about. But he's using this as making a deal, but he's meeting with the NATO allies first, and I tend to think my reading of this is he's saying, what are you going to offer me, NATO? I already told you what I'm interested in. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be meeting Vlad later. I think it kind of prompts the Europeans to get their act together and how to deal with Donald Trump, because obviously if you read the mainstream press, there's a lot of antipathy towards the American president. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, I agree in that Donald Trump is first and foremost a businessman. I believe that he ran for president to further his own personal business interests and to expand his business empire. Let's not forget, for many decades, he has had long personal ties to both Saudi Arabia and Israel. In the first 6 months of his presidency, he signed defense contracts with Saudi Arabia totaling hundreds of billions of dollars. Now that demonstrates he's not going to change American foreign policy, but he is going to enhance it if it benefits him. Now, in regard to NATO, well, Donald Trump has raised the issue about how much NATO member states are contributing to the defense budget each year. Yes, but also the British Prime Minister has done that, and other leaders within NATO have done that as well. But that does not mean he doesn't believe in the objectives of NATO or the remit of NATO. When, in the last year and a half, as I said earlier, NATO has increased its presence on Russia's western borders. Who gave permission to that? It wasn't Theresa May. It wasn't Jens Stoltenberg. NATO is America. Donald Trump put his signature on paper to a consent to a NATO build-up, an increased NATO build-up on Russia's western borders. We mustn't be under an illusion about Donald Trump.
Yeah, okay, but I think, let me go to Ted here, but I think you can make the argument that that is essentially being forced upon the Trump administration because of the laughable, hysterical illusion called Russiagate.
Yes, but
that's
you could
a
say that
reaction
about the
to
Obama
it.
administration.
Yeah,
but you could say that about the Obama administration.
You're not going to get an argument out of me on that, but I tend to think that there are extraneous things going on here. Ted, I think also what Trump is doing when it comes to budgets is that, well, if Russia is such a threat to you, well, then why don't you pay up? I mean, if you're afraid, why don't you pay more? I mean, then if you're not afraid, then you have to rethink about the whole nature of NATO. Okay, and I think all our viewers know that Trump ran a campaign with having better relations with Russia. He's fulfilling his campaign promise. Okay, where it will go is anyone's guess. Go ahead, Ted.
Thank you. The business about building up the presence on Russia's border, that's a NATO process that requires consensus among all allies, and that's been in play for a lot longer than Donald Trump's presidency. That's the culmination of plans that started about 10 or 12 years ago, quite frankly, even before the incidents in Georgia and Ukraine. And now that has come to fruition, but it didn't cost America anything. So it's a concession that President Trump could easily make because it's not adding to his bottom line very much at all, only really fractionally on the margins. But here's the thing. He's log rolling. He's making a concession on that point, but he's going to expect logs to be rolled in his direction in turn. I think you're exactly right. I think he's pushing the 2% of GDP defense spending by everyone across the board in NATO on a very serious basis, because if countries in NATO don't agree to it, it's going to add to the Republican vote in 2018, and it's going to add to the Republican vote in 2020 when President Trump is up for re-election.
Okay, well, that's very interesting because it gives this opportunity. I like that, logs rolling in his direction, and we'll discuss what he could expect for that here. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on estranged allies. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing estranged allies. Okay, let's go to back to Glenn in Oslo. I think if we know that this summit with Trump and Putin is going to be their first one-on-one. It is a summit in a traditional sense, and we have already a precedent that what kind of summits that Trump likes, and that is Singapore. And Trump went there. He went there with big ideas. He left with big ideas. I think his approach to the press after the meeting with Kim was less than sterling. I thought he was a bit short in explaining details because there are not a lot of details. But there's a feeling among some people that Trump is going to want to make a big, all-encompassing deal. Ukraine, Syria, Crimea. He's a showman, and he likes the spotlight here. What are the chances in your mind that he will at least try to do that? Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, I think it's a good possibility, as he has hinted towards the need to get along with Russia, even though this has created some fear within NATO. And in order to do this, he might be trying to put together a great deal. And again, on one hand, he seems prepared to put a lot of pressure on Russia in terms of the build-up in Ukraine and in Syria. On the other hand, he's also more capable of offering something in return, as he doesn't. He seems quite happy about breaking with his NATO allies. And if he would come to this summit and, for example, offer Ukraine or Crimea in exchange for Syria, I don't think anyone would really be that surprised if he made such a proposal. So, and again, as you correctly pointed out, I think he really wants to bring a big victory home. And of course, making peace with Russia would be a great prize. Now, on top of it, he hasn't really made any secrets that he sees China as being the main rival. And in all fairness, Trump's position is actually quite reasonable, because the U.S. spend a fortune on its military deployments in Europe. And, well, what does it achieve? It alienates Russia and pushes Russia to China, which is the main challenger of the U.S. So I think that well, what Trump will probably try to do is to scale back the military. He will at least be willing to negotiate the scaling back of the military in Europe, and divert this money back home, and instead allow big countries like Russia and China, Iran to balance each other. But of course, it's very dangerous to make predictions about this man. So
exactly, Marcus. Let me go to you, because Glenn said, make peace with Russia. We're not at war, folks. Okay, I mean, no matter what the media says, there isn't a real war yet, at least here. Marcus, I saw you not disagreeing, and I know where you're coming from. I absolutely know where you're coming from, because it seems to me, again, if I can go back to the Singapore precedent, where's the detail? Okay, the bureaucracy is not behind him. His own people are not really behind him. I don't see that happening, and that's why I think it's kind of interesting. This Helsinki thing might be a repeat of that. It might look great. It might be optics and handshakes and backslapping, taking dandruff off someone, but at the same time, I don't think that there can be one magic wand that's going to take care of all these problems, because there are too many bureaucracies, part of the military-industrial complex and the deep state, that have so many vested interests in all of the conflicts that we just mentioned. It's not going to be easy, not by a long shot. Go ahead, Marcus.
Look, Peter, I don't like any American president, be it Obama,
yes,
be it Bush, be it Bill Clinton. If Hillary would run, I wouldn't have liked her. But I will always support communication, and I support this meeting between Trump and Putin, like I supported the meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un. Even if they disagree on 99%, at least there might be 1% where they agree on, and that is good for world peace and world stability. But Russia has these key demands. Firstly, that the American missile defense system in Eastern Europe is dismantled, that America withdraws NATO from Russia's western borders, and that America puts into writing that NATO will not lust after Ukraine or Moldova or Georgia. Now, Donald Trump, indeed no American president, is ever going to consent to that. Two other very quick points, Peter. NATO only acts if America says so. If the rest of NATO wanted to do something but Washington was against it, then NATO it wouldn't happen. But also as well, I know that when you become president, the machines of the American government, they come round you. Sure they do. But if we're going to say that deep state is responsible for what's happening now with Trump, then we have to apply that to Obama. In his election campaign in 2008, what did he say? I want a reset with relations with Russia. I don't want any more wars of intervention.
And see what happened.
We know what happened under Obama. All American presidents are the same. It's the system. The system is entrenched, and the system is reprehensible, in my humble opinion.
Yes. Okay, you want to jump in there, Glenn? That's the point of the program.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one small comment regarding what was previously said before the break in terms of Trump being only self-serving. I don't necessarily agree with this, as he, in my book, very much defines as an economic nationalist. And I would point out that Russia doesn't necessarily need a deal with Trump, as this is a man who's been complaining publicly since the late 1970s about the U.S. drowning in debt in order to pay for the security of its allies. So given that for 40 years he's been arguing that allies should pay the U.S., I think this lack of commitment essentially would make any deal more possible, rather than him having the ability to essentially work within all of these structures.
Okay, it's a very good point. Ted, it occurred to me. It occurred to me earlier today is that I think that Trump has this envelope in his pocket, and he has a list of all of his campaign promises, and he's going through and he's checking those boxes. Okay, because he's focused on that. He doesn't have a grand strategy for anything. Actually, he's looking at the midterm elections, and he's looking at his re-election in 2020, and he's looking at his Nobel Peace Prize. He's looking at all of these things here. And that's why, in Canada, if he annoys the others in the G7, who cares? Because it's not on his envelope list, okay? He doesn't care, all right? And he's going to go meet with Vladimir Putin. Well, he's already been accused of being a Russian spy and working with the Kremlin and all that. I mean, that's already baked in, okay? I mean, it's old, it's boring for most of the public. So I think, he's a get better relations with Russia. I met Putin. I committed myself. I kept my promise. I actually think he thinks that way. Go ahead, Ted.
Well, as someone who was a member of the American Foreign Service for 26 years, by the way, I was in the same training class as the former Ambassador James Melville, I've seen a lot of the deep state in action, and I partially agree that the deep state gets its hooks in every American president, but I partially disagree, and I'll tell you why. I watched Barack Obama go to Prague and say he wants to think about a world without nuclear weapons. And then I saw the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy close in on him, even behind his back with our own allies at NATO. Even when he was going around saying we're going to have a nuclear-free world and we're going to make some great, fantastic nuclear-free deals, and I'm going to leave my footprints in the hands of, in the sands of history as the great disarmer. Didn't happen because his own people from DOD and DOE were going around NATO to the capitals of countries that were interested in maintaining the nuclear status quo and saying, don't budge an inch, we've got this, Obama will be gone sooner or later, don't give in on any concessions on nuclear policy. Okay, and that's exactly what happened. Now, why I disagree about Donald Trump is that he's not a politician. He's a businessman. He didn't write a book called The Art of the Status Quo. He wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. And he's in the process of making deals in a lot of different ways. Now, one of the deals he's making right now is with the deep state, because he's currently undermining and undoing the Department of Justice and the FBI and their attacks on his presidency. He's going to win that fight. Mueller has nothing on him on Russia collusion because there was no Russia collusion. And meanwhile, Trump is peeling off FBI agents one by one who've all been foolish enough to leave email trails saying where they were partisan political actors for the previous administration. So watch that space. I think Donald Trump is able, uniquely, unlike other American presidents, to peel himself free of the worst parts of the deep state.
Marcus, weigh in on that, because that would be, I guess, world historic. I mean, at least in the modern American presidency. I mean, reflecting upon what Ted just said there, what about, remember Ronald Reagan and a world without nuclear weapons? I mean, it's not the first time it's been said. I mean, and Reagan was quite serious about that. I've read memoirs about it, and everybody around him like, oh, no, you don't want to go that far here, okay? I mean, it's really interesting what Ted said, because, it is a kind of the cards are stacked here. But I want to go back to what I said earlier. I just don't think that Trump does have a vision. He wants it cheaper. He wants everybody to pay their way because he thinks that's more fair. But I don't think there's any kind of, I want to rejig the entire architecture of the Western security world. I don't think he has those thoughts, okay, in between cheeseburgers, okay? He's just going to say, he's going to go back to Fargo, to a rally and say, I made them pay up. And everyone's going to cheer. And you know what? Not a bad idea. Go ahead, Marcus.
Yes, I mean, in regard to Obama, I was bitterly critical of his presidency. But I would say this, at least when he left the White House, the Saudis and the Israelis were celebrating. Now, that's a compliment in itself. We can't say the same about Donald Trump, because when Donald Trump became president, the Saudis and the Israelis had their man in the White House. And of course, what has he done? He has worked very closely alongside deep state, or I prefer the traditional expression, the American establishment, in strengthening America's relationship with Israel and with Saudi Arabia. As I said, in April 2017, something like $600 billion arms contract he signed with Saudi Arabia. That is absolutely incredible.
Marcus, and the people of Yemen are at the short end of the stick of that too. Okay, we're almost out of time here.
The people in Yemen, they haven't noticed the difference, have they, with Donald Trump becoming president?
Glenn, let me go to you. We're almost out of time here. But I think I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I think Trump does have one thing he wants to deal with in his presidency, and it's Iran. We don't have time to talk about it, but for the very reasons that Marcus just said. Go ahead. We have 30 seconds, Glenn. Go ahead.
Iran becomes a very different situation than Russia, of course, and it's quite possible that when he goes to Russia, he might want to deal on Iran. But keep in mind that Russia burned itself on this with the Obama administration by essentially accepting the Americans dropping or the missile defense system in return for sanctions on Iran. But we saw what happened. NATO returned with missile defense as a NATO asset. So I don't think that Trump is going to be able to get Russian Russian cooperation against Iran again, as Iran looks.
On that note, we started with NATO, we ended up with Iran. That's all the time we have, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in London, Oxford, and in Oslo. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.